Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Well, for those of you who actually do occasionally read the Bible, I'm going to try to clear up a little confusion this morning. Excuse me. I'm going to clear up some confusion, I hope, about the apocalypse and what we're supposed to be doing while we wait patiently for that. Now, gloom and doom prophecies about the end of time are real popular. And wild-eyed teachers, they just love trying to scare people to death, telling them how horrible everything's going to be. But you got to learn how to read the Bible and how not to read the Bible, and some of that stuff you can just sort of laugh it off. You can't just take off reading the Bible like a dime store novel and jam everything together just like it was all just in a neat little package there. I come across this little nugget when I was studying Luke, and there's a whole truckload of truth come boiling out of it. Luke 21:28. And when these things begin to come to pass, panic and run. No, that's not what it says. It says, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Don't worry, be happy. Jesus said you ain't supposed to worry when you see all these perilous times and all this foolishness we're going through. He just got done, right before that verse, a warning the disciples, excuse me, about how bad it was going to be on earth. And he told them not to worry too much about it because their redemption was fixing to draw nigh. Now, most people read that and they just automatically, they read all that whole section in Luke and automatically assume that he's talking about us today and the end of time and everything. That ain't what he was talking about. Well, it was at the very end of it, that's what he was talking about. But worst case scenarios, people love bad news. They love it. You turn on the news, try to hear some good news. They don't tell it. Today, everybody's outlook on everything is so bad that they just automatically assume the worst. Kind of like that time that I somehow or another got a little lipstick on my collar, and I ain't got a clue how it got there. And when I got home, Ann automatically just assumed the worst. Anyway, bad news sells soap. It does. People love bad news, and bad news is what pays the TV station's bills. They love bad news, the same reason they love scary movies. Commercials are what pays TV's bills. They sell their airtime to advertisers to run their commercials. And advertisers can look up how many people's actually watching a certain program based on its ratings. And the more people that's watching it, the more they pay for the advertisements. That's why all you hear on the TV, besides lies and propaganda, is gloom and doom. It's always the bad stuff, and their motto is, if it bleeds, it leads. They don't report good news because people don't want to hear it. People love it. They love bad news, and the bloodier it is, the better. Same thing is true in churches. Now, which one do you think more people would love to hear? A soft, sweet, soft-spoken Mr. Rogers type feller, quietly, calmly explaining the benefits of being a Christian, or a ranting and raving, spewing lunatic with a serious hoop, running back and forth across the stage, wiping slobbers and hollering the world's going to end next week, and screaming all kind of hellfire if you don't fill his collection plate. C.H. Spurgeon had a warning for churches. I'm just going to read it to you word for word here. This is C.H. Spurgeon. I do not find many souls have been converted to God by exquisite dissertations about the Battle of Armageddon and all of those other fine things. I have no doubt the prophesyings are very profitable, but I rather question whether they are so profitable to the hearers as they may be to the preachers and the publishers. People have a desire to know the future, and certain preachers pander to that depraved taste by prophesying for them and letting them know what is coming by and by. I don't know the future, and I shall not pretend to know, but I do preach this because I know it, that Christ will come, for he says so in 100 passages. When I was a kid, it used to scare me to death when my Aunt Laverta and my grandma would sit around the table talking about the end of the time, end of the world, the end of time. The way they was talking, I thought, well, it's probably a couple of weeks out here at the most. And then sometimes when I was sitting in church, that preacher would get to hollering and everything, and I got to thinking like he was making up a load right then to take with him. To me, now looking back on that, it sounds like they was talking about a scary movie they'd just seen. And in all of my almost 73 years, I've never heard a single sermon on Luke 21:28, which I'm going to read it again. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Them preachers treat that verse the same way they treat good news on the TV station. But that one little verse puts everything together that you need to know about the end time. Now, if you're curious about the end of time and the second coming and all that, you're just like those disciples was back then. Like I said, Jesus had just finished the Sermon on the Mount. And they're walking back home, and his disciples asked him questions, because he said the temple was going to be destroyed. They asked him questions about when that temple was going to be destroyed, and when he answered them, he gave them a whole lot more than they asked for. Jesus started off talking about the temple and Jerusalem, because they were admiring it and bragging on how pretty it was in the sunset. And he told them that thing was going to be destroyed before they died. He said it was going to be destroyed in their lifetime. Then he also told them not to worry about the bad things that was going to happen right before he come back. And Luke 21 verse 5. And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said. Okay. They was on their way home, like I said, after the Sermon on the Mount, when they stopped to rest a few minutes on the Mount of Olives. And they could see the temple down there, and the sun was setting, and that sunshine shining on that temple. It was gorgeous. And they told Jesus, man, hey, come here and look at this, how pretty this is. And it was all lit up by the sun, and it was just spectacular. It was made out of glittering white marble. And Herod had covered it with all kinds of solid gold decorations. The old rabbis back then used to say, if you haven't seen the temple, you haven't seen the perfection of beauty. And when old Titus in AD 70, when he was destroying Jerusalem, it amazed him how big them rocks of marble that they used. Some of them blocks of marbles were 50 foot long and 15 foot high. And it was covered with gold, like I said. Herod had made this huge golden grapevine with huge clusters of golden grapes hanging on it. There was all kinds of golden crowns and shields and tubs and pots made out of gold in the courtyard that were given to the Jews by the kings and princes that come to visit. When they went to bragging on it, Jesus busted their bubble. In Luke 21 verse 6, right after that, right after they talked about how pretty it was, in Luke 21:6, Jesus said, "As for these things which ye behold, the days will come, in the which there shall not be one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down." He told them not only is it going to be tore down, but there won't even be a single stone left standing on another one. And Josephus, in his history, said that Titus didn't really want to destroy the temple, but when the soldiers got to tearing stuff down, they got carried away. And the only thing they left standing was 3 towers and a piece of the western wall. That's all they left standing. The whole place was flattened out and dug up like you'd dig up a garden, so much that nobody would ever believe a city had been there. Well, after he told them that, they asked him the same question that you'd probably ask him, the same question you probably want to answer to, in Luke 21 verse 7. And they asked him, saying, "Master, but when shall these things be, and what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass?" Now it was Peter, James, John, and Andrew. That's the 4 that asked him when it was going to happen and what the sign was going to be. And when he told them, they probably had some mixed emotions about the answer. They was just dreading the destruction of their temple and Jerusalem, and all the suffering and death that was going to come with it. But they was also looking forward with joy that Jesus was going to come back in glory, and they was going to get to share in it. So they wanted to know more about the times and the seasons. By now they'd probably figured out that Jesus wasn't going to set up his earthly kingdom like they'd been taught in Saturday school. Okay. Everything Jesus had been saying lately was sad and gloomy. It was all about his death. And then he said something about coming back to life or something. They figured out he was going to leave them for a little while and then come back and set up his kingdom in the rubble of Jerusalem. They just wanted to know when. The first half of his answer was not about him coming back. The first half of his answer was about the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple. Then he stopped talking about the doomed, chosen people of Israel and give a short rundown about world events before he came back in glory way down the road. Now, them disciples, that's probably pretty let down when he started, because they didn't know how many centuries, how many ages was going to pass between AD 70 and Jesus coming back. They didn't know. But his prophecy, it gave detailed instructions that saved the Christians in Jerusalem. It saved their lives. Verse 8 through 19. They divide that prophecy into 4 sections. Verses 8 through 19 are the signs of the immediate destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and it's real important that you don't get those signs mixed up with the signs of his second coming. Now, verses 20 through 24 is the actual sign of Jerusalem getting destroyed. And it's followed by the church age, the times of the Gentiles. Verses 25 and 27 is talking about the coming of the Lord that will bring the time of the Gentiles to a close. And then verses 28 through 36 tells you what you're supposed to be doing between now and then. All right, let me go through a little bit of that. Verse 21, Luke 21, verse 8, and he said, "Take heed that ye be not deceived, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ. And the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them." Now, back when the apostles was talking to Jesus, back then, there was a lot of pretenders that pretended to be the Messiah. Josephus, that Roman historian, said that there was a guy named Theudas. It talks about him in Acts 21, verse 38. A guy named Simon Magus claimed to be the Messiah, and he had a competitor named Dositheus, and then Dositheus had a disciple named Menander. Every one of them claimed to be the Messiah, and they brought a bunch of people to follow them, and they showed up between the time Jesus went up into heaven and the Jewish war in AD 70. But before Jesus started his ministry and was rejected by Israel, there's no record of anybody claiming to be the Messiah. And the reason for that is the true Christ had to show up first and get rejected before God would allow them to be fooled by false messiahs. Okay. And then Luke 21 verse 9. Now this, the stuff I'm going to be talking about now, a lot of folks think he's talking about the end of time, right before he comes back. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. 21:9. But when ye shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. Josephus and Tacitus both, they're historians, talk about the time right after Jesus was crucified as just all of a sudden, just being completely full of wars, violence, and earthquakes. Tacitus said it was a time rich in disasters, horrible with battles, torn with seditions, and savage even in peace. And then, the next verse, Luke 21:10, then he said unto them, nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in diverse places, and famines, and pestilences, and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven. Well, turns out that's exactly what happened between the time Jesus took up into heaven and Jerusalem being destroyed. Famines, pestilences, earthquakes, and all that stuff, they were unusually common in that area. And then the next, Luke 21:12. But before all these, they shall lay hands on you. Now bear in mind, the people he was talking to were Christians. They were Jews, but they were Christian Jews. And he was talking to them as Christians. But before all these, they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. Jesus quit talking about all the wars and the famines and the confusion and the pestilences and disaster and everything about to come in the age the disciples were living in, and started telling them about the stuff that was going to happen to them personally. Then he told them, don't be shocked and dismayed when all that stuff starts happening. Now when he said, we started that verse off saying, but before all these. Now, the real meaning in the Hebrew of that word before, you know what it means in English. It means, before that happens, this is going to happen. In the Hebrew, in the Greek, it says a more accurate meaning is probably more important. But more important than all that bad stuff going on around you is what they're going to start doing to you. You're going to have to be persecuted, but don't lose hope and don't give up your faith. And Acts is full of all the details of all the persecution they had to go through. And Luke 21:13 says, and it shall turn to you for a testimony. Settle it therefore in your hearts not to meditate before what ye shall answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries shall not be able to gainsay nor resist. I got 3 examples here. When Stephen was standing and answering his accusers including Paul. Well, it was Saul at that time, including Paul. And when Paul was standing before Felix, preaching to him, and then Paul preaching to King Agrippa, Jesus told them, his disciples, that they had to be ready to sacrifice their home, their family, their peace, as their price for being a friend of his. They'd have to give up their mother, their father, their friends, and he said, some of you they're going to put to death. And that was literally true of them 4 people that he was talking to. Luke 21:16 says, and ye shall be betrayed both by parents and brethren and kinfolks and friends, and some of you shall they cause to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. And every record you find of the Christians in that period says every word of that's true. Acts 28:22, as concerning this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against. Then Jesus said something to the Christians in Jerusalem. He said in Luke 21:18, but there shall not an hair of your head perish. Those Christians, well, it wasn't just Jerusalem, the Christians in Palestine, the whole state, were warned by those prophecies of Jesus that spread like that word that he told those 4 apostles spread. They were warned by those warnings, and they followed his directions, and they escaped the city and escaped the slaughter of the non-Christian Jews when it fell in AD 70. And here we go now in the next verse in 19. This is the heart of the whole matter right here. Luke 21 verse 19. In your patience possess ye your souls. He don't tell them to get on Facebook and start throwing up posts about how sorry everything is and how the country's getting ruined and oh my, you know, none of that stuff. It said quiet, brave, patience during all the difficulty, perplexity, and danger was what Jesus wanted Christians in those days to have. Luke 21:20. You hear this and all the time. And then people saying, this has got to happen before Jesus comes back. That ain't what he's talking about. Luke 21:20. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. And that's when you head for the hills. When you see them armies surround Jerusalem. Verses 20 through 24 are the signs for the Christians in Jerusalem and Palestine that the end has come for the temple, for the city, and for the Jewish people. There'll be an increase in wars and rumors of wars, famines and pestilences and all that stuff's going to scare you. And they're going to let you know that something big is coming. That's the signs. But the wars and the other stuff he is talking about that have been going on for the past 30, 40 years wasn't what he was talking about. The wars and stuff are not the immediate sign that Jerusalem's about to get destroyed, but he said, when you see that Roman army surround Jerusalem, run. Run hard as you can go. He said, when you see it, and not before then, run from the temple at all costs, for there's not going to be any deliverance from God. God has left the building, just like Elvis. God has left the building, and he's given up his chosen people. When Jesus told folks that saved the Christians from the destruction. The Jews, they never did stop believing that God was going to deliver them because Jerusalem was his holy city and his temple was in it. They believed that. But the Christians was given a warning 40 years before that siege that the time of Israel's mercy was gone. Luke 21:21, it says, "Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." Historians tried to guess how many Jews got killed in that. They said that over 1,100,000 Jews fell when they sacked Jerusalem. And after they got done killing folks, Titus told them soldiers to wipe Jerusalem off the face of the earth. Make it look like a place where nobody'd ever lived. Now, it got rebuilt on its old location, but it didn't have a temple, no temple. And it was trampled down by the Romans, the Syrians, the people, the Norsemen, and the Turks. And we're living in the times of the Gentiles. The times of the Gentiles is the time between AD 70, when the temple got destroyed, and when Jesus comes back. That's what the time we're living in. And the Gentiles, church of God, not the little one down the road, the big one, holds the position of God's favor and honor in place of the Jews during the times of the Gentiles. We got grafted in. Now those words separate the destruction of the temple from the next part of this little prophecy. That everything that I've talked about has been about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, before that verse 24, where it says, "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword until the times of the Gentiles," everything before that was talking about Jerusalem and the Jews. Now, he gives them a little more. He starts talking about his second coming after that in verse 25. Luke 21:25. "And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, and the sea and the waves roaring." Jesus had just got done answering their question about when they were supposed to expect the temple and the city to get destroyed. Because the temple belonged to the time they was living in. But his glorious return is going to be way down the road in the far distant future. He told them the city's going to be destroyed, and y'all are going to live to see it happen. And that destruction is going to be complete. It will be irreparable. But then a new age will begin, called the times of the Gentiles, and that's when them unwashed Gentiles are going to get their turn at bad, okay? Then there's going to be whole ages pass before the times of the Gentiles get fulfilled, and after that, after the Gentiles' age is fulfilled, and not 1 minute sooner, Jesus will return in glory. Now, in those 4 apostles' minds that he was telling us to, all that was connected to some kind of mysterious, glorious return of their master, and he told them somehow or other there's going to be part of it. They didn't have a clue what he was talking about. Paul goes on later on in 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and says, he describes what it's going to look like. 1 Thessalonians 4:16, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds, to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Now, after he answers their question about the temple, he goes on and answers a question they really want answered. Well, when's that going to happen? He said, well, the sun's going to be darkened, the moon will stop giving her light, stars are going to fall from heaven. Now, I realize that sounds all dramatic and everything, but you've got to understand that's the kind of language that the Hebrew prophets used when they prophesied about the Hittites getting fallen, so when the kingdoms was falling. Jesus was using language that them Jews was already familiar with, but he meant for every word that he said to be fulfilled literally. Before Jesus comes back, our world, physical world, is going to go through some serious changes. The physical laws that you studied in school that govern the movement of the earth and the stars, they're going to get turned loose. And the results are going to be terrifying. There's going to be tremendous physical disturbances that will come before his second coming. 2 Peter says this, 2 Peter 3:10, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with a fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in all holy conversation and godliness, looking for, this is what you're supposed to be doing, looking for and hasting unto the coming day of God, wherein the heavens, being on fire, shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Then every man on earth, every single person on earth, will be able to see Jesus coming in the same kind of, I said it's supposed to come in the clouds, that's the same kind of bright cloud that surrounded him twice before. Once on the Mount of Transfiguration, and again when he was took up into heaven. He was surrounded by this cloud. So what are we supposed to do? What do we do? Jesus gave them Christians in Jerusalem some real specific instructions, and it saved their lives. Like I said, then he's telling us the same thing. Luke 21:28, and when these things begin to come to pass, then look up. Lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Now, when these things begin to come to pass, he was talking to them apostles about the Roman army surrounding Jerusalem. Your redemption draweth nigh. Back then, he was talking about the Jewish Christians being delivered from the persecution of the Jews. And then also, after Jerusalem fell, Christianity grew like a weed. It had been growing for 40 years, but after the Jews were took out of the way, it took off in a growing spurt like it had never seen before. It didn't have to worry about them Jews killing them no more. Now, verse 28 also has a different meaning. It's got a deeper meaning that applies to us. Look up. Look up. Stop looking down. Stop focusing on all this trouble and foolishness and stuff going on in the world. Look up. Stop hanging your head in sorrow over all the trouble in the world and in your life. Lift your head up and rejoice. Be ready, be watching, and be waiting, because your Savior's coming. Now, you're supposed to be looking for the signs that Jesus is on his way, because watching and waiting, that keeps your hope alive. Because you know that when he comes back, that means you're going to be delivered from all the pain and all the suffering of this life. Now, when you're reading prophecy like that, and this is true of all prophecy too, not just that one in Luke there, you got to make sure who a prophecy is wrote for and what it's talking about. Prophecy is not a romance novel. Verse 32 has messed up a lot of folks. It messed me up for a long time. Luke 21:32, I just assumed that was talking about prophecy at the end of time. Luke 21:32 says, verily, I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. He's not talking to you. That's not you. This generation, those 4 apostles and the folks that was alive when they were. This generation shall not pass away. He's not talking about the church. He's not talking about the human race. A generation is a period of 30 to 40, somewhere in there, 40 years. Jesus was warning them apostles that in 30 or 40 years, everything that he said was going to happen. His prophecy was about the signs they're supposed to look for right before the Roman army destroyed Jerusalem. It was the plain and simple answer to that question. What do we look for? How are we going to know when this is going to happen? Now, what he said in the next verses about his return, he added that. He told them that wasn't going to happen until the times of the Gentiles was fulfilled. Sure enough, 40 years, almost to the day, after he told them 4 apostles that, temple, city, the Jewish people, they was all destroyed. 40 years later. Now then, instructions. He gave us some instructions for looking up and lifting our heads up in Luke 21:34. And take heed to yourself, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, and so that day comes upon you unawares. Nothing on earth is more important than watching and waiting. When it was time for Jerusalem to get destroyed, there wasn't no mistaking them signs. Jesus is talking to us too. We're not looking for Jerusalem to fall. We're looking for a much worse destruction than anything that ever fell on the Jews in Jerusalem. All people in every age need to be watchers and waiters till he comes back. Luke 21:35, for as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch ye therefore, and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. We're living in the last days, and I prove it by the Bible. I'm going to prove it to you. People, oh, we're living in the last days. Whoop-de-doo. We've been living in the last days for 2022 years. 1,000 years ago, Christians expected Jesus to come back in their generation. Right, they were looking for him right there. 2022 years ago, give or take a year or two, the very first Christians thought they were living in the last days and Jesus was coming back then. The New Testament says clearly that the last days began when Jesus was born. Okay. Hebrews 1:1. God, who at sundry times and in diverse manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the world. And Peter said in 1 Peter 1:20, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but who but was manifest in these last times for you. 1 John 2:18. I mean, this is the last one. There's plenty of them, but this is the last one I'm going to quote. 1 John 2:18. Little children, it is the last time. And as ye have heard, that Antichrist shall come. Even now there are many Antichrists, whereby we know that it is the last time. Whew. This ain't nothing new. We've been living in the last days for over 2,000 years. The Old Testament prophets looked forward to the last days when God would do a new work. In Acts 22:17, Peter said that what happened on Pentecost fulfilled Joel's prophecy. Acts 2:17, and it shall come to pass in the last days that, saith God, I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Pentecost was the official start of the last days. That means Christians have always lived in the last days looking for Christ to come back. And for those folks that try to set dates and, oh, well, this has got to happen and that's got to happen and all that stuff, 1,000 years is like a day for the Lord. We can't set a date, especially since Jesus said nobody knows. Nobody knows when it's going to happen except the Father. Jesus don't even know. These last days will end as soon as God's good and ready. Today, if you're a Christian, you are guarded by the power of God because of your faith. And you're waiting for your salvation to be revealed. 1 Peter 1 verse 5. Who are kept by the power of God through faith unto salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. And then Jesus, in Matthew 28:20, He promised He's right here with us. Matthew 28:20, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Amen. Now, if all that's true, then we've got a serious question about identifying the signs of the times. Now, here's some questions to think about, okay? Apostasy, falling away. Paul predicts in 1 Timothy 4 verse 1, now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. Then he warns Timothy about them, and there was already people doing that in Paul's time. And there have been apostates throughout all of church history. Now, apostasy might be getting worse. I don't know if it is or not. You can't really calculate how close it is to Jesus coming back by how many apostates there are. And then you got conflict, famine, and all these cosmic disturbances that are going to happen. Jesus said it's going to be full of that stuff. And it's tempting to start looking at the history of catastrophes to see how close we are to the end of the world. When Napoleon was running all over the place, just kicking countries' booties, a lot of people thought Napoleon's wars was a clear sign that the end of the world was on us. World War I, they said the same thing. World War II, they said the same thing. And they're going to say the same thing about the next World War. It might be the beginning of the end, but Acts 1:7, Luke didn't stutter and your ears didn't flap down when he said, and he said unto them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father hath put in His own power. Okay, now here's something that made all them people trying to set dates and everything, it made goosebumps stand on up on. The nation of Israel. Surely that's a sign. Well, that's the one thing They made all them people trying to set a date just a little bit too sure of themselves, is when Israel got established by the British as a state of Israel in 1948. But that brings up a couple of serious questions, okay? Bear with me a minute while it sounds like I'm bashing Israel, because I'm not. Paul never gave up hope for the nation of Israel. Romans 11:25, for I would not, brethren, that it should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceit, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. Who was he talking about? Is he talking about the nation of Israel? Does that mean that all the Jews that have died during the times of the Gentiles up to 1948, all them are lost, and only a privileged few will be saved right before the second coming? Or is he just talking about the Jews living in the state of Israel, the nation of Israel? There's more Jews in New York City than there are in Israel. Okay. Now, a person would have to be blind or stupid if he couldn't see the miraculous way God has delivered the Jewish people throughout all their persecutions and afflictions and adversities over the centuries. But you got to be careful saying that the British letting Israel have a little piece of land there is a sign. You think you got to be careful saying that's fulfilling prophecy. Did you know that nowhere in the New Testament does it say that the state of Israel will be reestablished? The only thing it says about the kingdom in this time is in Matthew 21, where Jesus says the kingdom is going to be took away from Israel. The apostles were all Jews. The Christian apostles, all they had to preach from was the Old Testament and the oral teachings of Jesus, and they never once, not one single time, did they mention the nation of Israel being reestablished. Not once. The church. We're going to talk then about this right here. The church in the tribulation. Now, I don't much like to do this because I get hate mail, okay? I'm not 100%, I'm about 99%, not quite 100% sure about the rapture. I'm not 100% sure. I'll tell you why. Now, there's a reason for it, and it's a question. This fellow named David Adney spent half of his life as a missionary in Asia. He said when that Mao brought all that tribulation on the church in communist China, the church was caught completely off guard, because they had been taught by the missionaries that the church was going to be spared tribulation. What we tend to forget an awful lot is that suffering is one of the marks of the church. The church has experienced suffering throughout the ages, and Revelation 22 makes all that clear. Suffering, persecution, and tribulation is not the same as the wrath of God. Paul says to the Philippians, in Philippians 1 verse 29, for unto you it is given in the behalf of Christ not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake. Now, it'd be nice to think that God, and it's real popular to think that God's going to save the church from the sufferings of the end times. Be careful. If the church is going to be raptured out before the reign of the Antichrist, why does Paul say this in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 3? Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. I'm just saying, okay? Don't send me no hate mail, okay? Don't sweat the small stuff. There's not much hope that everybody in the body of Christ is going to agree on the details of end times prophecy. If we have any hope of preserving a unity of spirit, then we got to be big enough to let folks have different points of view. It's a sign of insecurity and just downright meanness when Christians can't tolerate anybody that understands the Bible different than they do. It's probably a good idea not to get bogged down in that mud hole of end times prophecy. That's what it is, a big old mud hole. That you can't allow somebody to look at one of these minor questions different than you do. What you ought to be doing is celebrating. Instead of sweating the small stuff, you ought to celebrate the big stuff. Jesus is coming back soon. You're going to get resurrected. The kingdom of God is going to win. It's going to come out on top, and you get to share in the glory of God. Then if you don't necessarily agree with the Adventists or the Catholics or the Baptists or whatever, if you don't necessarily agree on this is going to happen, this and this and this, that's not important enough to cause hard feelings, splits, and divisions. It hadn't stopped it, but it ain't important enough to. I appreciate y'all putting up with me. I'll see you next week, I hope.